I died in the year when I loved him the most. Richard locked me in the basement for a whole day and night just to comfort his white moonlight. Later, a short circuit caused a fire, and I suffocated inside. In my last moments, I saw a boy who was frantically smashing the door lock with a bench and rushing to my side. The flames burned his clothes, but he didn't care at all. Who was he? I can't remember. All I know is that in the end, I died in his arms. After death, my soul lingered by the boy's side. The fire grew stronger, but he held me tightly, not moving at all. I couldn't help but push against him, roaring, "Run! Are you just going to wait here to die?" But I knew he couldn't hear the screams of a ghost. Until the fire truck rumbled in, and a dozen firefighters carried him out in a flurry. Finally, I left that cursed basement. Outside, the sun was shining, and it was a beautiful day. I saw Richard, nervously pacing outside the villa. He grabbed someone and asked, "Has the girl from the basement been rescued?" Oh, he still didn't know I was dead. You see, the boy I had loved for 10 years didn't dare rush in to save me, even as the flames engulfed me. My body was still held tightly in the boy's arms. He ignored everyone and walked straight to a black car. He opened the door and placed me in the passenger seat. He even thoughtfully buckled the seatbelt around my lifeless body. Then the car sped away, leaving the villa area. The boy was fleeing with the dead girl, like a scene from a movie. We left the city. The scenery outside gradually changed to fields, villages, and then beaches. He arrived at the sea. A deserted, undeveloped beach. Finally, the car stopped. He carried me out, slowly walking into the water, sinking together with me. He said, "Amelia, I'm Nathan. Do you remember me?" Is he about to confess? Confess. Confess. I opened my eyes to find myself standing in a high school classroom, surrounded by classmates who were 17 or 18. A girl pushed me, saying, "Amelia, is that a love letter you're holding?" A crumpled piece of paper in my hand, the envelope clearly labeled, "For Richard." I had traveled back to the day I confessed to Richard in high school. It was a Friday afternoon, just before school let out. In 5 minutes, Richard would walk into the classroom. I was about to hand him this love letter in front of everyone. What did he say back then? "Oh," he said, "sorry, I'm not looking to date right now." No, I shook my head, "You've got it all wrong." At that moment, Richard walked in through the classroom door. Someone shouted, "Richard, Amelia wants to talk to you." A curious tone. I tore the letter in half, calmly saying, "It's nothing, we're just joking." After saying that, I tossed the shredded paper into the trash. Richard stared at my face for a long moment. He didn't say anything and returned to his seat. The crowd of onlookers sighed in disappointment. I thought there'd be a good show. Let's go, let's go. I flipped through my book at my desk as the end of school approached, everyone excitedly packing their bags. But I vaguely remembered there was something else. Maybe it didn't seem important back then, so I buried it deep in my memory. Until the homeroom teacher walked in, and I snapped back to reality. It was him. When the students saw the homeroom teacher enter, they immediately stirred, whispering complaints, "Wow, what time is it? School's almost out." The teacher frowned. Our school was a private institution, considered elite, and the students here were all either rich or powerful, making it hard for him to manage. The teacher waved to someone outside, "Come in." Nathan walked in through the classroom door. I remembered. He was the transfer student who came to our school in his senior year from another city. He always wore faded school uniforms and carried an old, worn-out backpack, completely different from the lavish style of the other students. Perhaps because of this, he rarely spoke to anyone and was often isolated. He usually sat in the last row, working through practice exercises by himself. Yet his grades were excellent, consistently ranking in the top 3, especially in physics, where he almost always scored full marks. Nathan leaned forward and introduced himself, "I'm Nathan, I transferred here from the neighboring South City." The teacher nodded. He pointed to a seat in the back row and said, "You can sit there." So Nathan walked to the back of the classroom with his backpack, sitting behind me. He slowly took out his textbook and neatly arranged it on his desk. He seemed a bit anxious and bewildered. But that was okay. At 17, we still had time and a chance to start over. After the teacher left, the classroom buzzed again. Everyone turned to curiously observe Nathan. David, the class troublemaker, approached and asked, "South City? That coal mining town next door? My family does business there too. What's your dad's name? Maybe my parents know him." Nathan fidgeted with his fingers, looking a bit flustered. He stammered, "My dad doesn't do business, he just. Is he a coal miner?" David jumped in, laughing. Many people here learn to look down on others from a young age, preferring wealth over poverty. Curiosity drew others in closer. David became even more smug, picking up Nathan's book and holding it to his nose. "I can really smell coal." "Ha ha ha ha." The disgusting laughter echoed. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and splashed water from my cup onto David's head. "Is your nose a dog's nose, David?" Soaked, David glared at me in anger. He rolled up his sleeves, glaring at me. "Amelia, are you looking for trouble?" "Sorry, but I really have been dead." Maybe high school Amelia was shy and reserved, but 28-year-old Amelia was not. I smiled. "Yeah, looking for trouble." In the end, nothing happened. Richard came over, frowning at me. "What's up with you today? Go home." Richard was the class monitor, and Nathan's family was the most powerful in South City, so David wouldn't dare mess with him. But when I saw him, all I could think of was the raging fire. It felt terrible to be suffocated by smoke. I said, "Let's not go back together anymore. I want to stay after school, to study for the college entrance exam." Richard scoffed. He looked at me strangely. "Amelia, what's gotten into you?" I pointed to the classroom door. "Could you please not disturb my studying, class monitor? The class beauty from next door, Catherine, is still waiting at the door for you." Richard, Catherine, and I grew up together. Our parents often did business together and frequently interacted socially. I used to think Richard was really good to me. He called me sister. But it turned out he really only saw me as a sister. The one he liked all along was Catherine. Catherine waved to us from the door. "Richard, what are you and Amelia talking about? Are you two leaving or not?" Richard glanced at me again. He tapped my desk with his finger. "You really can't handle physics. I can help you over the weekend." Then he picked up his backpack and walked over to Catherine. In the end, only Nathan and I were left in the classroom. The clock on the wall ticked away. Behind me, Nathan's pen scratched against the paper. My impression of him would always be that of a serious, diligent student. But, "Nathan, what do you see me as?" I turned around, resting my hand on the back of my chair, studying him closely. His brows and the corners of his mouth slowly merged with the man who had held me in the fire. He said, "Amelia, I'm Nathan. Do you remember me?" I must have been staring too intently, as Nathan sensed something was off. He looked up at me with a puzzled expression, rubbed his chin thoughtfully, and asked cautiously, "Is there something on my face?" I shook my head quickly and replied, "No, no." It was so embarrassing. To break the awkward atmosphere, I casually pulled out a set of physics practice problems from the desk drawer, flipped to one page, and placed it in front of Nathan. "Can you help me explain this problem?" Seeing the question, Nathan immediately relaxed. He glanced at it and said, "Well, this problem isn't too difficult. But I still can't solve easy problems." I was terrible at physics. I was the type who dragged my scores down in every exam. He took out a scratch paper and wrote down 2 formulas. "It's just like this, and then this." Then he asked, "Do you understand?" I slowly nodded my head. He smiled and said, "How about I help you build a foundation?" Nathan must have seen the confusion in my eyes and realized my true level. He closed the practice book, took out the textbook, flipped to the beginning, and gently said, "Let's start from the first chapter and take it slow." I felt that Nathan's tutoring skills were much better than my rigid high school physics teacher. And definitely better than Richard. That's right, in my past life, I always trailed behind Richard, bothering him with all sorts of mistakes. "Richard, can you help me look at the work-energy theorem?" "Richard, why can't I ever solve the last question on the math test?" "Richard." So annoying. It's no wonder he always shot me a cold glance, Are you an idiot? You don't know anything. Until the school security came knocking at the door, standing sternly at the classroom entrance, shouting at Nathan and me, "What are you two doing here so late? Why aren't you going home? Do I need to call your parents?" Only then did Nathan and I realize it was nearly 8 o'clock. The school was about to lock the doors. So we quickly packed our bags, apologizing as we rushed outside. We ran all the way to the school gate, where a car was honking beside me. The driver rolled down the window and called out, "Amelia." It was Driver, our family driver. Seeing I hadn't gone home this late, he specially came to pick me up. "Hurry up and get in the car. Your mom is waiting for you to have dinner," Driver said, giving me a stern look. I quickly opened the car door and turned back to Nathan. "Nathan, it's late. Do you need us to give you a ride home?" "No, it's fine. My home is far away in the western suburbs, not on the way," he replied, showing that awkward expression again, with a slightly stiff smile. "Besides, there are buses at this hour, it's very convenient." Nathan waved goodbye to me and ran towards the bus stop. The western suburbs are really far, the bus takes over an hour. I've only been there once, and it's not fully developed. Everywhere is filled with old buildings and single-story houses, with trash piled on the ground. I called out to him, "Nathan." He turned back. I asked, "Do you know my name?" Under the streetlight, his face flushed slightly. I said, "My name is Amelia. You need to remember that." Although I had traveled through time, I didn't bring any high school academic knowledge with me. It's a tragic thing. Plus, I was just an average student with a mediocre IQ, so I had to spend my weekends poring over high school textbooks at my desk. Almost every line was filled with notes. I'm not smart, but I've always worked hard. While I was struggling with the knowledge points, my phone suddenly rang, startling me. It was Catherine. She sent me a photo on WeChat. It was the library study room, a few books, and 2 cups of milk tea on the table. Her face showed discomfort. "Amelia, Richard came to study on the weekend, and I'm not even a student focused on academics, it's so boring. Are you coming?" Catherine is a dance major. Richard is really something. I never thought he'd choose to study at the library for a date. I simply replied with 2 words, "Not going." She didn't respond anymore. I continued reading. As I read, my brain felt like a mess. I really missed how clearly Nathan explained things to me that afternoon. I opened my phone, downloaded the updated contact list from our class group file, found Nathan's number, and called him. He picked up quickly. "Is this Nathan?" "Amelia?" he asked hesitantly. I laughed. "I was doing some problems and thought of you. I hope I'm not interrupting you." We talked about a lot. We discussed which teachers in our class were the strictest, which were a bit snobby, and some long-standing campus tales and gossip that Nathan had never heard before. He kept agreeing with me, occasionally exclaiming in exaggerated surprise. It really satisfied my desire to share stories. This boy is really gentle. But why can't I remember where we had crossed paths before? After chatting for quite a while, we hung up. I casually opened Instagram and scrolled through. I was surprised to see that Richard actually posted something for once. Reviewed some physics concepts today, learned quite a bit. The image was a corner of the physics practice book. There were a ton of likes and many comments from classmates. "Teach me. Physics is really killing me. How did the genius get so serious? Richard, if you keep learning, you're going to get a perfect score. Please stop studying." Before Nathan transferred to our class, Richard had always been the top student, scoring significantly higher than the second place. It was only when Nathan arrived that his position began to be shaken. The 2 of them scored similarly on exams. They would take turns getting first and second place in quizzes. Other students always hoped to see a fierce competition between these 2 academic stars. But unfortunately, as far as I remember, the number of exchanges between Richard and Nathan was probably no more than 10 sentences. The 2 of them were really not familiar with each other. Feeling a bit guilty for having disturbed Nathan for so long, I decided to bake a box of cookies that evening as a gift for him. I used to enjoy making these little treats. I'd even bring the cookies and cakes I experimented with to Richard for him to taste. But in my previous life, once I went to his office, I happened to see the cookies I had given him in his drawer. He had eaten only one piece, the rest remained untouched, and some had even gone moldy. That's when I realized he didn't really like the things I made. My mom heard the commotion and came down to the kitchen to see what I was up to. "Stop wasting food," she frowned. "Richard doesn't even like this stuff, can't you make something else?" "Who says these are for Richard? I'm giving them to my new classmate," I replied, puffing up my chest and answering loudly. That was quite bold. My mom looked at me with surprise, exclaiming how I had changed. The next day during break, I turned around and placed the cookies on Nathan's desk. He carefully opened the box, and his eyes lit up instantly. Surprise, joy, and a bit of confusion. He said, "Amelia, you're the first person to make cookies for me." It felt so good to have my efforts recognized. Just then, Richard walked by, holding a stack of papers, coming out of the teacher's office. He happened to pass our row, suddenly stopping in his tracks and looking at us, confusedly asking, "Did you make these cookies?" "Huh?" This guy always pops up out of nowhere, startling both Nathan and me. Richard stared at the box of cookies for a moment, then said curiously, "Amelia, you said you wouldn't casually give away things you made." I scratched my head. I think I really did say that back when I was pursuing Richard in high school. "Richard, no one else gets to eat the desserts made by me, Amelia." That love-struck brain of mine, why did it have to expose me? I thought to myself, Nathan is definitely not just anyone. I didn't want to engage with him. Seeing that I wasn't talking to him, Richard turned to chat with Nathan instead. "I heard you're doing well in physics," he casually picked a topic, placing the papers on the desk. Nathan shook his head and responded humbly, "Not really, just average." No need to be so modest. Richard pulled out a test paper from the stack, handing it to Nathan. "This score is quite high. This is from the quiz you took when you transferred. I just went to the office to get last week's quiz paper and brought it back for you." I leaned over to take a look. Aside from losing a few points on the last big question, everything else was perfect. Richard pointed at the deduction and said, "This is a question from the physics competition. You should think about it some more." In my previous life, Richard had been getting tutored by an off-campus teacher to prepare for the physics competition, and he ended up winning an award, which even gave him extra points for the college entrance exam. Noticing that I was listening intently, he suddenly flicked my forehead. "Amelia, do you understand?" I glared at Richard, annoyed. "Don't bully me too much. Do you really think I won't improve?" He laughed, and surprisingly, his expression softened a bit. "Why didn't you come to the library this weekend? Didn't I say I would help you with the questions?" It was the first time I heard him say something like that. "But..." I shook my head. "I can just ask Nathan, he sits right behind me." Richard's expression stiffened. He glanced at me, then at Nathan, said nothing, and coldly walked away with his exam paper. After taking a couple of steps, he turned back and said indifferently, "Amelia, you'll come to Catherine's celebration party next Saturday, right?" Catherine's celebration was a turning point that changed everything. Catherine was an art student, and the academic requirements weren't too high. As long as she met the criteria for the art exam, she was almost guaranteed a spot at a school. In my previous life, she performed exceptionally well. Several good dance schools extended offers to her. It was a huge deal. Catherine's dad hosted a feast at a 5-star hotel and even gave her 2 days off, allowing her to invite friends to celebrate. The only condition was that they weren't allowed to stay overnight. It wasn't surprising that her dad made such a request, she usually hung out a lot. Her friends came from all walks of life. Catherine booked a luxurious suite, and I went too. There were classmates from our school and some friends from her art classes. It was loud and chaotic. Richard and Catherine were surrounded in the middle. They were teased into singing duets. As it approached midnight, my mom called me via video. Catherine happened to be beside me and saw the caller ID. She said, "My mom said she went shopping with yours today and is probably still at your house playing mahjong. My phone is dead, so don't answer. She'll definitely use you to drag me back." Reluctantly, being the obedient daughter I was, I answered. Sure enough, 2 people appeared on the other end. My mom and Catherine's mom. Catherine's mom had a particularly loud voice. It's so noisy over there. Catherine, don't you see what time it is? Are you coming home or not? Tell me where you are, and I'll send the driver to pick you up. Catherine rolled her eyes in protest. Mom, are you annoying? I just finished my exams, and you let me have a night out. Am I missing an arm or a leg? Both of them had stubborn tempers. After arguing for a while, Catherine's mom finally said, if you don't come home tonight, don't even think about your allowance next month. Catherine was the little rich girl at school, with a monthly allowance of 50,000 yuan. That statement made her shut up immediately. She cursed under her breath as she hung up, declaring that her night of freedom was over. Later, Richard accompanied us downstairs, waiting for driver to drive over. During this time, Catherine hadn't said a word to Richard. She was a bit upset. While on the phone with her mom, she kept signaling to Richard, hoping he would come out and say a few words on her behalf, even just, don't worry, I'll take care of Catherine tonight. Catherine's mom really liked Richard and even had intentions of setting them up. If Richard had spoken up, he might have actually agreed to Catherine's request. But that night, he remained completely cold, indifferent to Catherine's plea. In the end, Catherine couldn't argue with her mom and had to go home with me. It's all your fault, she stomped her feet and gritted her teeth, you two are no good, what a downer. On the way home that night, we were in a car accident. The traffic police later concluded that our driver was driving under the influence and was fully responsible. Catherine and I lay in the hospital for half a month. Her injuries were more serious than mine. She had damaged ligaments in her leg and wouldn't be able to dance for years. Catherine's mom cried heartbrokenly at her hospital bed. She confronted the driver, insisting he pay with his life. The driver later faced legal consequences and had to pay compensation. But what good did that do? Catherine's family had plenty of money. This was a turning point. If that accident hadn't happened, Catherine would have stayed in the country, and the three of us would have continued our high school friendship. Years later, Richard might have ended up with Catherine. I would probably feel sad, maybe. But after crying it out, I would generously bless them and go on to find my own path in life. But that car accident changed everything. Catherine gave up on the dance academy and went abroad to study at an art school. Richard and I ended up in the same city for college, and occasionally, we would run into each other. He knew I had a crush on him, but the thing he said most often was, Amelia, do you think you deserve Catherine? We were both wrapped in guilt. He would fly across the country to buy almond cookies for Catherine and send them to her abroad. He would also stay up late setting alarms to grab concert tickets just to accompany her to the venue. As for gifts for holidays, birthdays, and anniversaries, he never missed a single one. Later, after living abroad for a few years, Catherine returned to the country. Richard found their old friends and threw her a celebration party. It got loud until dawn. After Catherine finished singing a song, she held the microphone and suddenly said to me, Amelia, now that you've graduated for so many years, does your mom still care about what time you come home? At that moment, the air went eerily silent. I knew she had never really forgiven me. Richard helplessly called out to her, Catherine. Don't interrupt me. Catherine had drunk some wine and her tone became rough. Amelia, aren't you the good girl? Since you can't hang out with us anyway, why not lock you up in a little room? You'll be happier that way. She clung to Richard's arm, her voice sweet. I couldn't say a word. I wanted to argue, but it always felt like I owed her something. Richard sighed. He glanced at me, then took out his keys and, along with Catherine, locked me in the basement. I cried and shouted, but it was useless. I struggled, but it didn't help. Catherine patted the basement door and laughed, wait until I finish the party, and then I'll let you out. I didn't know why her party lasted so long. All I knew was that a fire broke out. In my past life's tragedy, now that I've crossed over, I won't let the same tragedy repeat itself. I knew it was almost impossible to stop Catherine from celebrating her exam success. I chose not to attend. If I didn't go, our driver wouldn't drive us there. On Saturday night, Richard called me. When are you coming over? It was noisy on the other end, and I barely heard him. I'm not going, I'm studying, I said. Suit yourself. After a brief silence, Richard replied coldly. I hung up the phone, thinking that my reputation as a diligent bookworm was officially spread. Around midnight, I went downstairs to check again. The driver was in the kitchen, video chatting with his old army buddies, drinking and chatting. He saw me and waved, "Amelia, why aren't you asleep yet?" I opened my mouth, hesitated, and finally said, "You're getting older, you should drink less." In the living room, several women were having a great time playing mahjong. Catherine's mom had just won a hand and was in high spirits. She glanced at the clock and suddenly remembered something. "Oh no, Catherine went out tonight, I wonder if she's back by now. I need to give her a call." But her phone was off. When she tried again, it still wouldn't connect. One of the girls nearby urged her, "It's your turn to be the banker, don't tell me you're planning to run off with the winnings?" Catherine's mom didn't try to call again. While shuffling the tiles, she laughed, "What are you all saying? Do you think I could cheat?" I lay in bed, watching the clock tick away slowly. Outside, everything was calm. It felt like an incredibly ordinary night. Slowly, I drifted into sleep. The next day, I was woken up by my mom. "Amelia, come down for breakfast." It was only 8 o'clock. Still groggy, I reached for my phone on the bedside table and opened Instagram, starting to scroll. A classmate had posted a story. "School beauty and top student, a perfect match?" The photo showed Richard and Catherine. They were both slouched on the sofa, eyes closed, with Catherine's head resting gently on Richard's shoulder. I guessed the party must have ended late, and everyone was exhausted by the end. Someone caught a whiff of gossip and snapped a picture of them, even uploading it online. There were plenty of teasing comments below. "I've noticed something was off between these two for a while. My favorite couple." Seeing the photo, I suddenly felt wide awake. I shot up from bed. The accident didn't happen, Catherine didn't leave the celebration, everything was fine. I was so excited that I quickly liked the post. Then I commented, "This is great." In no time, when I refreshed the page again, the story had disappeared. Richard actually called me. "Amelia," he said out of the blue, "last night got a bit wild, and I went to sleep halfway through." I didn't join in afterward. What was he telling me that for? He chuckled, "I thought you would go. If I'd known you weren't going, I wouldn't have gone either." I touched my nose, unsure how to respond. We fell into silence for a moment. I finally said, "If there's nothing else, I'm going to have breakfast." He replied, "See you at school tomorrow." Even though the photo on Instagram was deleted, the gossip spread quickly. Especially since many classmates had attended Catherine's party that day. When I got to school on Monday, I could feel the buzz of private gossip swirling around. But I didn't join in. Because in just a few days, we'd be getting the results of the monthly exam. This was Nathan's first major exam since transferring. When our homeroom teacher announced the rankings, he built suspense. This time, there's a dark horse in our class. After all, competition leads to improvement. He paused, "Nathan, first in the grade." The classroom erupted. This was the first time Richard, who had always been first, was pulled down from the top. "Nathan, that transfer student Nathan? He doesn't even talk to us." With the college entrance exams coming, another top student shows up. Even though I already knew Nathan's abilities, my excitement was uncontainable. I turned around and excitedly ruffled Nathan's hair. "Nathan! You're amazing." Nathan's hair was left a mess from my excitement. He didn't seem angry at all, he just smiled gently. My deskmate must have found it unbearable and elbowed me. "Keep it down." She shot me a look. "Can't you see Richard isn't happy?" I followed her gaze, to see Richard sitting against the wall, looking back at Nathan and me. His lips were pressed into a thin line, his gaze icy, as if he were about to freeze into a sculpture. I immediately felt a jolt. How insensitive of me. Richard had been first in the grade for almost 3 years. Suddenly dropping to second must be tough for anyone. And here I was, grinning away, wasn't I just rubbing salt in the wound? I cleared my throat twice. I toned it down a bit. After a while, Richard finally shifted his gaze away from me. I let out a breath of relief. Thanks to Nathan's tutoring, my grades had improved quite a bit. So now, every Friday after school, I would voluntarily study for 2 more hours with him, benefiting from his help. But unexpectedly, Richard stayed behind too. As soon as the bell rang, Catherine rushed to our classroom door. "Richard, time to go home." She waved to him just like before. Richard didn't leave or pack his bag. He turned to Catherine and said, "You can head back first. I'll stay a bit longer to study and then leave." Everyone who hadn't left turned to look. "Class monitor, you don't have to do this. You're already getting in with lower scores. You're really going to stress us out." Due to his competition wins, Richard's target school had lowered their admission requirements for him. Even if he didn't perform at his best, he definitely wouldn't fall below the cutoff for his ideal school. Richard ignored them. Once everyone had left, he just grabbed his books and sat next to me. I was a bit confused. Richard explained, "It's easier for us to discuss problems here since you're close to Nathan." Wow. That left me speechless. Should I step aside and give the two top students some space? Before I could say anything, Richard pulled out a problem and started discussing it with Nathan. "Nathan, do you have a simpler method for this problem? I think I'm overcomplicating it." I recognized it as a question I had gotten wrong on the exam. So I decided not to kick Richard out and just quietly listen to the two top students debate. I took advantage of the situation. After an entire evening of study, I felt like my brain cells were evolving. Richard and Nathan's approaches to solving problems often differed, so their discussions often sparked new ideas. It wasn't until nearly 8 o'clock that Richard knocked on my head with his book and said, "Amelia, time to go home." I finally snapped back to reality. "Yeah, let's go." After I told my mom I would be studying at school after Friday classes, she had driver come to pick me up 2 hours later. Nathan insisted on taking the bus home and never let me give him a ride. This time, Richard joined us too. This wealthy second-generation heir didn't even have a car sent to pick him up. Richard rubbed his nose and shamelessly looked at me. "Why not have your family driver take me home? Didn't our families used to take turns picking us up after school?" I rolled my eyes at him. "Richard, can't you learn from Nathan and take the bus home, contributing to energy-saving efforts?" Richard scoffed at my logic. "Should I call your mom and tell her you left me at school all night, not caring if I got hurt?" I was truly exasperated. We sat in the back seat. Driver was quietly driving in front, and for a moment, I found that I had nothing to say to Richard. The city's scenery slipped by outside the window. Suddenly, Richard asked me, "Amelia, there are only a few months left before the college entrance exams. Have you thought about where you want to apply?" That question reminded me. It was time to think about my application plans. I wanted to go south, to see the sea. But in my previous life, I had followed Richard to a northern university. It wasn't that the city was bad, just that it didn't suit me. Seeing me silent, Richard added softly, "When you decide, tell me." He took a deep breath, as if making a resolution, and looked at me. "I want us to go to school in the same city." I was caught off guard. "Aren't you already set on the university you're applying to?" I countered. "A top-tier school, with lowered admission scores." More importantly, that school had many connections from Nathan's family. Most of Nathan's family friends and relatives had graduated from there, so he had no reason to change his target school now. He shook his head. He didn't answer my question but just repeated, "Amelia, we need to be in the same city in the future." I wasn't interested in being in the same city as Richard. That night, I curled up in bed and texted Nathan. "Nathan, have you thought about which university you want to apply to?" After sending it, I felt the question was pointless. Considering Nathan's grades, he could probably get into any school he wanted. Nathan replied quickly. "Not yet, what about you?" "I want to go somewhere warm, humid, where I can see the sea," I typed, imagining it as I went. Funny, so do I. This guy was clearly just copying me. In my previous life, I had worked hard in high school, but a lot of it was just to go to the same place as Richard. This time, I wanted to work hard for myself. As the second semester of senior year began, the atmosphere in our class gradually turned serious. The countdown to the college entrance examination weighed heavily on everyone's shoulders. Even at our private high school, We weren't exempt from tradition. The principal organized a pre-exam rally, inviting the top few students to speak about their study and exam experiences. Unsurprisingly, Richard and Nathan, the typical top students, were chosen as representatives. I remember that rally being dreadfully boring. I only managed to stay awake until Richard's turn came, and after his eloquent speech, a few other classmates couldn't hold on any longer and quietly slipped out of the auditorium to stroll on the playground. I don't have any memory of Nathan's speech. Maybe I missed it because I left early. Looking back, it feels a bit regrettable. Fortunately, I had a chance to relive it. This time, I made sure to stay fully alert, waiting for Nathan to come on stage. However, after Richard finished speaking and the next speakers were already up, I still hadn't seen Nathan's figure. Just then, an organizer from the student council walked by, and I grabbed their arm, asking, "Hey, do you know why Nathan from our class hasn't come up?" "I haven't seen him either," the person frowned, their tone not very friendly. "He isn't answering his phone, and we had everything scheduled." "It's totally messed up, what's going on?" I suddenly realized that something might have happened. I jumped up and ran out of the auditorium. Where could he be? I took out my phone and called Nathan. Just as the student council person had said, I called several times, but all went unanswered. The school was so big that I felt like a headless chicken running around between the classrooms. As I kept uselessly dialing Nathan's number, I tried to reassure myself, he's not a little kid, he should be fine. Until I reached the playground, memories suddenly flooded back into my mind. I remembered. In my past life, after hearing Richard's speech, I had sneaked out of the auditorium to take a walk. As I walked toward the gym, I heard strange shouts and commotion. Driven by curiosity, I approached the window and saw several classmates from my class surrounding a boy, mercilessly punching and kicking him. They were cursing at him. At that moment, I didn't know why, but my sense of justice flared up. I pushed the door open. I pulled the boy away from them, saying, "If you bully him again, I'll tell the teacher." I even left those words with a fierce tone. Looking back now, that boy was Nathan. I took off running. I dashed to the gym and slammed the door open. The scene before me was exactly the same as in my past life. Nathan was surrounded in the middle, with a few delinquents from our class, including David, nearby. "Isn't your family just in the coal mining business? Think you're special just because you study well? Still want to give a speech? I won't let you. I just can't stand your self-important attitude. What skills do you even have?" After spending time with Nathan, I realized that his environment in class was much harsher than I had imagined. In a school like ours, cliques formed easily. And Nathan, with his gentle personality, having transferred here from a different school and coming from a poor background, didn't belong to any group. So he often faced exclusion. He even experienced bullying. In this world, he had me as a friend. I couldn't imagine how lonely his life must have been in my past life. Perhaps it was precisely because of this situation that he became particularly sensitive to even the slightest kindness. Maybe I just casually pulled him away from David's group, but it meant so much to him that he remembered it for so long. I wasn't afraid of David and his rich kid friends. When they saw me, they blocked my path. "Amelia, what are you doing, playing the hero?" This was different from the previous scenario. Especially since I might have come at the wrong time. The rally had ended, and students were leaving. Some noticed the commotion here and peeked through the door. What? I don't remember it being such a big deal last time. Seeing the onlookers, David became even more excited. "Amelia, I've noticed something's off between you two. Are you two dating?" If it were an ordinary student today, I wouldn't bully Nathan so much. But it's you. Here's the deal, if you admit you like him, I'll apologize. Our school loves gossip. The surrounding students let out a synchronized "ooh." "Who is that?" "That's Amelia from class 4, and our top student." Nathan stood up and tugged at my hand, his face pale. "Amelia," he smiled, "it's fine, don't feel pressured. There are so many classmates here, what can he do to me?" Though he said that, I really can't stand being provoked. "So what if I like Nathan?" I retorted, raising my voice. "Is it illegal to have a crush? Which school rule says we can't date?" Being straightforward wasn't that hard after all. Everyone probably didn't expect me to admit it so boldly. In an instant, there was silence. Even the cheers of the onlookers stopped. It was David who stuttered first, breaking the silence. "Amelia, a heroine among women. What's going on? Gathering for trouble?" Suddenly, a sharp voice came from the back of the crowd. "We haven't even taken the entrance exam yet, do you want to get a demerit?" The crowd instinctively parted to make way. The person approaching looked a bit familiar. I thought for a moment and realized it was the student council president. The president pointed at David and his gang, speaking sternly, "You're about to graduate, and you're still bullying fellow students? Have you read the school rules? Don't you know we strictly prohibit bullying? Prohibiting bullying is one of the important rules at our school." Although in reality, there are countless instances of students privately excluding those who are weaker. But it never escalated to the point where the school had to intervene. This time, David was going to be a typical example. The president pointed at each of them, you, and you, all come with me to the office." After taking roll call, he turned to the people behind him and said, "Richard, I'll go tell the teachers about the situation. Are you coming?" That's when I realized Richard had come with the student council president. He had been standing in the shadows, and I hadn't noticed. Richard shook his head, suddenly pointing at Nathan. "Let Nathan come too. After all, he's the one involved, and he can clarify things." The president nodded and waved his hand to take everyone away. David shouted, "Help! I don't want to see the head teacher." "That's not up to you," the president said, patting his head. The onlookers, seeing the main characters leave, knew the show was over and dispersed in a rush. I initially wanted to go with Nathan and wait for him outside the office. But just a few steps down, someone suddenly grabbed my wrist. Richard looked at me, his expression serious. "Amelia, come with me." I then noticed his face was as pale as a sheet, his lips trembling slightly, as if he was suppressing some overwhelming emotion. "What for?" I asked softly. He pulled me close, not giving me a chance to refuse, and pushed me into a corner. Richard was much taller than me, and now he was so close that it felt oppressive. "Amelia," he frowned, trying to steady his voice, "I understand you wanted to help Nathan today, but you could have called the teacher or called me, you didn't have to do it this way." "Oh, I got it." He thought that my declaration of liking Nathan today was just a temporary decision out of helpfulness. I laughed. "Richard, you're mistaken. I'm not just being kind, I really like Nathan." Hearing this, Richard seemed to be momentarily speechless. He stood there, stunned, not saying a word. After a moment, he showed a pained, anxious, and somewhat pitiful expression. Suddenly, he pulled out a torn letter from his pocket, carefully holding it up to show me and asked, "Amelia, you're lying to me, right? What did I do wrong? You can't possibly like Nathan. If you did, how could you have written me a letter like this?" That was the love letter I wrote to Richard. But I had already torn it up and thrown it in the trash. I didn't understand how it ended up in Richard's hands. I looked at him in confusion. Richard gave a somewhat bitter smile and admitted without hesitation, "Yes, I dug it out of the trash. I admit I wasn't sure how much I liked you at the time, and I was afraid that dating in our senior year would affect my studies. But I never thought, Amelia, that you would like someone else." Seeing that letter, I actually felt a sense of relief. My secret crush on Richard was coming to an end, and that wasn't a bad thing. I snatched the letter from his hands, tore it into smaller pieces, then opened the window behind me and threw it out. The shredded paper scattered in the wind, never to be pieced back together. Richard's expression changed, and he hurried to the window, gripping the frame with both hands. Leaning halfway out, he gritted his teeth and said, "Amelia, you." "Richard, from the moment I threw away that love letter, you should know I don't like you anymore. From now on, unless something important comes up, don't come looking for me. Like you said, we all need to focus on the college entrance exam and studying, right?" The next day, as soon as I walked into the classroom, I felt all my classmates staring at me. Normally, I wasn't flustered. I sat down, opened my book, and started reading. But it was already self-study time, so where was Nathan? I tapped my deskmate's hand and asked, "Where's Nathan?" She teased me with a look, "You don't know?" Because of your outburst yesterday, David got caught by the school and is now a typical case of bullying. He has to give a public apology during self-study today. Nathan is probably dealing with the fallout too. As we were talking, the class loudspeaker blared to life. The voice of the deputy principal came through. There has been a serious bullying incident at the school that has had a very negative impact, and it's necessary for the main offenders to make a profound apology. David and his cohorts looked like wilted eggplants, completely stripped of their usual bravado. Each one mumbled apologies. The classmates listening all lowered their heads, trying not to laugh. I couldn't hold it in and burst out laughing too. The deputy principal asked Nathan if he accepted their apologies. Nathan calmly replied, "Honestly, I've never paid attention to them." He felt completely above them, no matter how arrogant they were, it didn't matter to him. I almost wanted to applaud him under the desk. But the next moment, he brought me into it. "Amelia, I feel like I should be the one to confess. I like you." I was stunned. My deskmate spit out her drink, eyes wide, looking at me. "Wow, you two are showing off your affection in front of the whole school." As a result, Nathan and I each had to submit an apology. But at least we could hold hands openly around campus now. Though dating seemed like it would hinder studying, my boyfriend was the top student in our grade. How could I not make good use of such a significant boost? Difficult science problems became lively with Nathan's company and explanations. The entire second semester of senior year seemed to pass less painfully. Time flew by. Then I suddenly realized I hadn't really noticed Richard in a while. He no longer stayed after class on Friday afternoons. Even when he passed by Nathan and me on campus, he would quickly look away and walk past. It seemed he was truly following through on my earlier words and no longer disturbing me. The moment college entrance exam results were released, I was at an internet cafe, teaching Nathan how to control minion waves. Suddenly, the class group chat exploded. Someone messaged, "Help! The college entrance exam results are out." Nathan and I immediately abandoned our game, grabbed our phones, and entered our exam numbers. My score came out quickly, exceeding my usual performance by 30 or 40 points, an extraordinary achievement. I shouted in excitement and turned to check Nathan's phone screen. There seemed to be a problem on his end. It looked serious. The result showed 0 points. My hands trembled as I quietly asked, "How is that possible? Did you forget to write your name or mess up your exam number?" Nathan shook his head. His finger slowly moved to a small line at the bottom of the screen. "Your ranking is now in the top 50 in the province. Please check the specific details soon." I squealed and hugged Nathan. The guy next to us playing games took off his headphones, confused, and glanced at us. "What's got you so excited?" I blushed and lowered my voice. "Nathan, which school do you want to apply to?" Nathan smiled and ruffled my hair. "I'll decide with you." Later, a prestigious Southern university offered Nathan a full scholarship and allowed him to choose his major. I got accepted to a nearby teacher's college. Everything seemed to be falling into place as planned, except for Richard. A few days before the deadline for submitting college applications, I suddenly received a call from Richard's father. "Amelia, can you do me a favor and persuade Richard to apply to University A as originally planned?" University A was the target school that had lowered its admission score for Richard. I then learned that Richard had not performed well on the exam and hadn't reached the admission line for the top national business schools. But with the 60 points from University A, he could still attend as initially planned. To be honest, I didn't quite understand why Richard's father called me. First, facing this situation, why was Richard hesitating to apply to University A, one of the top schools in the country? I couldn't comprehend it at all. Second, as an outsider, what could I possibly say to persuade him? But since he was an elder, it was hard for me to refuse his request. So after hanging up, I called Richard. It rang for a long time before he picked up. After a moment of hesitation, I asked, "Richard, have you not decided which school to apply to yet?" Richard's voice sounded tired. "No." In that moment, I felt a surge of frustration. "What's wrong with you, class president? What are you thinking? If you don't go to University A, where will you go? With your abilities, don't you think it's a waste to settle for an ordinary key university?" I wasn't sure how harsh my words were. But for a while, Richard didn't respond. After a long pause, he finally said slowly, "Amelia, I'm afraid if I go too far, you'll forget about me. Amelia, I want to go to university in the same city as you." So that was really how he felt. But Richard, it wasn't necessary, it really wasn't necessary. I said coldly, "Richard, if you do this, I will look down on you. Are you saying we can't even be ordinary friends anymore?" Richard went to university. Catherine passed her cultural exams and was admitted to a dance academy in the same city in the north. Nathan and I were accepted to a university in the south. Everything turned out perfectly. There were no car accidents, no injuries, and no subsequent fires. Our families maintained a great relationship, celebrating together with several graduation banquets. The parents even said they would take us to the airport for our flights to school. At the airport, Nathan and I were on one flight, while Richard and Catherine were on another. One was heading south, the other north. We said our goodbyes at the boarding gate. I linked my arm with Nathan's and handed him a backpack. Catherine reached out to touch Richard's hand, but he subtly moved away, appearing cold and distant. He looked at me, opened his mouth, but in the end, said nothing. I waved goodbye to them. "See you. Maybe it would be a long time before we met again." End.